Hello, and you're very welcome to Adapt Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Claire O'Connell, and today we're talking about new ways to approach the ethics of AI and digital technologies.
From the Adapt Centre at Trinity College, this is Adapt Radio, presenting groundbreaking innovations, one conversation at a time.
You cannot move an inch these days without encountering takes on the future of AI and technology and how it can be used for harm as well as good. So how can we deal with the questions and the dilemmas that new technologies are bringing up, and what can researchers do? Joining us today to talk about this are two experts from the Adapt Centre. Dr. Marguerite Barry is an associate professor, and Dr. Paul O'Neill is a postdoctoral researcher at the School of Information and Communication Studies at University College Dublin. Marguerite and Paul are doing research on alternative methods of ethical and critical thinking in the design of digital technologies and AI, which sounds like a very wise thing to do, and I cannot wait to find out more. So Marguerite and Paul, you are both very welcome to the programme.
Thank you, Claire. Delighted to be here.
Thank you, Claire. Great to be here.
So let's dive in. I mean, we hear a lot about the challenges that AI poses. Things like privacy, security, personal safety, etc. And you've both set your focus on the ethics of AI. So what do you mean by ethics and critical thinking in AI? Can you give us some examples?
Well, first of all, it's a huge question, right? And it's like a really big area because, I mean, philosophers have been looking at the ethics of all of the technologies that we use for, hundreds and hundreds of years. And I suppose it's really about kind of looking at new tools that we bring into our lives and then asking questions about the impacts that they have on us, but also on not just us as individuals, but society as well and communities, but also then looking at, well, if they allow us to do new things, do we need to think about the things that they're allowing us to do in different ways? Or, are they just extending things that we've always done, but maybe making it faster or more automated or maybe invisible and all kinds of things? And I think you can probably imagine already all of the ways in which our digital technologies have changed our lives hugely in the last 30 years, and all the things that we now take for granted, but that are really fast and invisible, and the way we do our work, the way we communicate socially. And so some of that is great, but some of it can sometimes inadvertently create harms for other people. And some of it, I think we're pretty aware in the last couple of years as well, can be very deliberately done as well, where there's anything from misinformation to, deliberately surveillance kind of, activities on people and those kinds of things. So we can see quite clearly, I suppose, some of those harms. And what we're interested in is, looking at kind of what can we do about the design and development of technologies to make those things clearer at the outset. But also think about it in a different way because, philosophers have done an amazing job up to now in kind of explaining to us what we should be thinking about. But then we need to look at the reality of like how design and development actually works and what might be useful for researchers when they're sitting down to think about, coming up with some new innovation.
Paul, what's your take on it? How do you think about ethics and critical thinking when it comes to design and development of new technologies?
Yes, I would agree with or build on everything that Marguerite has said there. And I guess my angle or involvement is really once we are thinking critically about the ethical concerns within the context of our own research, I look at it very much at a kind of communicating these concerns and ethics. So my kind of primary interest is at looking at different ways of communicating kind of complex themes related to AI, ethics, network technologies to diverse publics. And my specific focus within that kind of area is really looking at it from kind of art and creativity, and specifically what I would call critical media art practice and artists. So these are artists, again, kind of within the time span that Marguerite has mentioned over the last 20, 30 years that, critically engage with themes related to our current networked era, such as surveillance, data sovereignty, data ethics, the environmental impacts of information communications technologies, and how they communicate these communicate these complexities to diverse publics and audiences.
Can you give us some examples of how people have done that?
I can give you loads of examples. Yeah, I suppose, and I'm sure more are going to come up over the conversation. I'll talk about some of my own work maybe to begin with. So I've got a kind of an ongoing project called the Dublin Infrastructure Tour, which I've been running since about 2018. And it's a combination of a walking tour, academic presentation, and artistic intervention. And the purpose of the tour is really to trace and reveal elements of the physical internet infrastructure here in Dublin City, alongside the corporate topologies that support it. And what I'm really trying to do in this process is engage with critical concerns surrounding our collective relationship with, I'll use the expression big tech for want of a better word, while simultaneously demystifying and explaining the technical components upon which the internet functions. So what does that mean? What does it look like? I bring people around the city, and we'll start talking about everything about the history of telecommunications here in Ireland. So situating it in a kind of historical context, right back to the first transatlantic cable that ran from Valentia Island here over to Newfoundland, bringing that up to the fiber optic cables that run beneath the streets of the city now, which are kind of easily identifiable by looking at manhole covers. And then bringing people down to Grand Canal dock area of the city. So, we're thinking about the physical internet, but we're also thinking about the corporate internet and how these are connected. And then situating all of these things within the kind of wider debates around like the data center industry, which is obviously, as you know, here in both Dublin and in Ireland as well. And it's a very much an open discussion. So it's not me as the expert. It's like I try and make it as non-hierarchical as possible and accessible. And I've done it for activists, I've done it for academics, I've done it for general public as well. And it's just this kind of learning together and sharing. And I suppose we have DIY, so do it yourself, we're all familiar with. We also have DIWO, which is do it with others. So yeah, that's kind of one kind of example that I can give you.
I've done the walking tour and it's actually really great. The problem is there's only one Paul and he can't keep doing them all the time. But it is actually fascinating. And even like I might think that I might know things, but when you're confronted with the actual physical infrastructural elements and you can literally look at it on the street, it really connects things in a way to people, I think, that, goes way beyond what you can maybe read about in a paper or see in a presentation. So it's great.
Sure. Yeah. There's nothing like the physical thing in front of you. I'm going to have to ask you about the manhole covers to see where the fiber optic cables are, Paul. But in terms of what you have learned from people taking, going on the walk with you or engaging with that, what kind of revelations or learnings have people brought to you?
I guess, and it's a collective, specifically within relation to the internet and network technology, this thing that we all use, that we're using right now, that we're all so dependent. And again, I've given tours to experts. When you ask kind of questions like what is the internet or where is the internet, we really, often lack the vocabulary to explain it. And I've done this with students as well, and everyone's kind of the same. So I guess the surprise is how little we actually know or are able to explain about what this thing is that we all use and are so embedded and dependent on.
But people probably are aware, particularly when they're confronted with the questions about it, about the importance of ethical design of these technologies, because we've seen in the past what can go wrong when technologies maybe are implemented or they're brought into the market and people haven't thought about that. So can you talk to me about how people are currently going about designing technology in a way that one would see as ethical, designed for people and the planet's well-being?
So I teach a couple of modules in UCD on, information ethics and digital media ethics, but these are relatively recent across, all our universities in Ireland. I'd say it's probably the last 5 or 6 years there's been a focus on teaching it. And up until this point, researchers have been doing, I think, as good a job as they can within the constraints of the structure of, how you're supposed to actually design and develop technologies, which is like, you pitch an idea, you might get a grant for it and you need to get things up and running immediately. And I'd say up until about 10 years ago, it was kind of, get things out there, get them tested. And then often it might be kind of after the event that people would kind of notice issues arising, because really the priority is to have, something that's working and something that's addressing the problem that something has been designed for. And I think particularly with AI and with data-driven technologies, in particular before AI, but the massive volumes of data and the new platforms that were using these, there was a real strong focus, I suppose, developing on issues like fairness and, are the data sets that we're using to design things actually representative of the populations that they're making decisions for or recommendations about. And we've found, I think, to our cost that that they are not, because they don't include many marginalized or minoritized groups in populations. And there's been a lot of really great research that has exposed that. But then there's also issues around accountability, like, so many of these processes, like I say, on platforms in particular and on our networks are invisible and done at speed, and it's impossible to know who's responsible when something goes wrong. So it's trying to surface some of those things and make the design a little bit more accountable, where you can trace back maybe where decisions have been made. Then there's explainability people might have heard of in relation to AI. How did it come to that decision? How does Netflix know that I want to watch that thing? Because I definitely don't want to watch it, but maybe show us a little bit about how the algorithm is working there. And then issues obviously around privacy and data protection have been huge, and a lot of that has been actually driven by legal regulation as much as anything. So you've got these two things happening at the same time. You've got ethical questions, that aren't necessarily legal issues, but they're things that we should be thinking about. But then you have obviously the responsibility of regulation, and of course, as always, regulation is a little bit behind where technology is, if not a lot behind. It's taking a long time to catch up. We're getting there, but it's slow. And of course, the commercial impetus of technology development is always going to be way ahead. So it's a challenge.
And it's interesting to think about regulation. I think sometimes maybe people assume that regulation is one way to ensure that everything is ethical, but that's not really the case, is it? I mean, the ethics needs to be sort of baked in really at an earlier stage. And I know, like, even when it comes to doing research that relates to medical developments and that will involve people, there's a lot around medical ethics and the need for ethics committees to approve projects and everything. So is that the way forward, to have like that ethical approval at the research stage? Is that something that we need to bring in more?
Definitely. I mean, it is there, but I suppose to a certain extent, then that requires a certain amount of understanding. And I suppose it's a good thing that we have that example of medical ethics. But of course, that goes back a couple of hundred years to when they were, taking bodies out of graveyards, to do experiments and things. And then eventually people thinking, maybe we need to think about this. So, to a certain extent, some people might say that digital technology research is maybe catching up in that kind of way. So there's definitely regulation. But of course, we can talk about regulation. We're academics working in a kind of academic research environment, which is quite regulated, because there's public funding, being used to fund research and those kinds of things. Unfortunately, of course, the vast majority of this kind of development is happening in the commercial space, where there's very little regulation, because you're talking about platforms that are bigger than countries. So, and we can see that, people have probably heard about the new AI Act that's just literally been implemented within the last week in the EU. The text is just out, if anybody wants to look it up and have a read of it. But also similar moves in the US and in other parts of the world. And, it's been a really tricky negotiation. And you can see that there's a lot of influence coming from companies who just don't want to be regulated in the way that, states might want to regulate them. So, yeah, it's slow moving.
Yeah, there are a lot of parallels, I suppose, with the medical world, even with the way the EU AI Act is kind of approaching it, with different levels of regulation for different types of technologies that could have different impacts as well. It's kind of almost like that, generic or over-the-counter drugs versus prescription drugs versus, all that kind of stuff. So it is interesting to think about those parallels, but surely it does sound like there's some catching up to do. One of the key steps in your research is finding out what people think of AI, their attitudes towards it, and as well as the walking tours, where you get people kind of seeing there in person the technology and thinking about it. You also ran citizen think-ins, so tell us more about those.
Yeah, I could, I suppose, start a bit of those and then maybe lead into some of the other more recent work that's been done too. But so ADAPT Education and Public Engagement team has done a huge amount of work in the last couple of years in bringing research out to the public, really, and kind of not just in terms of kind of here, this is what we do and adapt, but also getting that feedback from people in terms of like, what do you think? You know, what are your interests in technology? What do you think we should be looking at? So a number of years back, they started this Think In series, which was kind of not necessarily bringing, like Paul was saying, kind of experts into the room to tell you what's happening, but really to sit people around tables and give them, I suppose, scenarios and dilemmas to think through about potential kind of future uses of technologies and to see what their levels of comfort were or what their questions might be around certain things. And it was a really great success that was done in Dublin, and now it's moved out around the country. What's great about it is bringing in obviously different communities, because we want to talk to people, to very young people, we want to talk to older people, we want to talk to people living in different communities or who may not come across academic research or technology research that often. So you can really get their feedback. And that's then fed into other things like the Dilemma Cafe. So this is a kind of another event that has happened at Researchers' Night and other ADAPT events where people can come and just chat to researchers and ask them questions and, you know, difficult questions and probing questions about what they're doing and whether they should be doing what they're doing or what the risks might be. And then, like, what I suppose Paul and I are interested in as well is in what other kinds of spaces can we create these types of encounters and conversations? How could we really reach out into different contexts that aren't about industry and that aren't necessarily about academia either, but are different places? So Paul was very involved in the Bea Festival of Art and Technology that ran in November last year in the Digital Hub. And Paul, I think you should talk about that.
Tell us about that one, Paul.
Yes, thanks, Marguerite. So the Bea Festival is a new festival of art and technology, critically engaging with the impact of emerging technologies on society. ADAPT was one of the was the main research partner with the festival, which was co-founded by Aisling Murray and the Digital Hub. So we had a kind of few different roles and activities in that, but myself, Marguerite, Danny Snow, and Kiernan developed something called the Ethics Studio, which was basically, the Bea Festival was a 3-4 day festival full of kind of talks and activations. And then there was a 2-week exhibition running concurrently. So within the exhibition component, we had the Ethics Studio, which, as I said, was led by Marguerite, Danny, myself, and Kiernan. And basically it was a space, kind of public space, dedicated to exploring ethics and examining the attitudes, ideas, values, and methods around ethical design and the development of digital technologies. We kind of purposely set it up and framed it as a live and active research environment, kind of conducting studies over the course of the festival, but obviously in a very informal kind of open access way, using different creative methods and tools. So within that, we had a couple of different activations. So we had one project called Facing Our Future, which was a heat map designed by an Irish illustrator called Anne Kiernan, who is currently based in Berlin. So it was basically a kind of a simple scale, with one scale representing the future time in which a technology will become available, whilst the other representing the impact that technology could have. We very simply asked the public to kind of input it, and although talking about kind of complex technological themes, you can do a lot with Post-its and stickers and color-coded stickers. So we just really invited the audience, the public, to come in and kind of add suggestions as to what technologies they think we should be considering, and a time span, I think it was from 1 to 50 years. And then other people could come in and they would have like red, green, color coded if they thought a certain technology was a good idea, bad idea, and so on. We also had another project called Share and Shred, which was, and Marguerite, if I'm explaining this wrong or you want to add, feel free to jump in. It was, basically a clothesline, or it looked like we had it set up with a clothesline. And again, people were invited to and we were thinking about like concerns around data privacy. And we were asking people to write things that maybe they had never kind of shared before, within reason. We made it as open-ended as possible. There was no pressure was put on, and kind of related to technology and how they felt about technology. And they were then given a choice. They could literally hang their piece of information up facing out so other people could come in and read it. And, nobody had to put their name or anything. Or if they wanted to write something that they didn't want to share, we then had a kind of a little bin where they could dispose of it. And what was happening, we had Anne Kiernan in the space for a few days. And apart from her illustrating, Anne has been doing a lot of work with weaving over the last couple of years, kind of incorporating that into her practice. So all of these pieces of paper were put into a shredder within the room. So then they were shredded out into little pieces, and Anne was creating her own kind of tapestry. We're kind of playing, I suppose, with the idea that even though we think our data is gone, it's never actually gone.
It's still woven into the tapestry of secrets.
There you go. That's the blurb there. And we also had another piece from Danny, which maybe Marguerite, you want to talk about it?
Yeah, absolutely. The other piece then was called the Data Bank, and this was an ATM machine, and it was that piece was really good fun because people could see that as they were walking by the ethics studio, and they'd stop and they'd turn around and go, that's an ATM. And it's amazing how ATMs, the light glowing around it just attracts people in, because immediately people think, am I going to get money from this or what? But this was a really interesting project being done by Danny, PhD student in UCD, and he's looking at people's attitudes to donating data. Like if we maybe could see a future where maybe we could hand over our data maybe in return for cash. And it could be kind of very specific types of data, maybe, health data or biometric data or something like that might be of a slightly higher value. And you could check out the value of different types of data and then maybe agree to share or not share. And he's also looking into issues then around donating data after you die. What happens to our data and what happens to all of these aspects of our lives that are increasingly online and in the cloud? So there's some really interesting questions there. But I think, like Paul was saying, so we had people contributing and using all these different things in this space. And we had Anne there as the artist who was weaving and chatting to people at the same time. And what was really amazing about it was how it created this kind of a community. There was no hierarchy in there again. We weren't there as researchers telling people what to do. We were asking them questions. They were telling us. And what we got out of it was this sense that people really want to talk about this, but they're, again, kind of lacking opportunities or places and spaces they can actually do this. And so we felt like it kind of really worked as an experiment because we got some really nice feedback. People were sharing quite intimate things in some cases and really kind of wanted to talk about them and had some very interesting and very strong views actually about what they thought, the directions in which technology should or shouldn't go. Sometimes around very simple things. It's often about things like access and, like, why can't everybody have 5G everywhere, but all over the world? This consciousness that like we have things that other people don't have and how they benefit our lives. But then also how, we don't know what's happening with a lot of our data online, and why can't we know? Why can't it be made more visible to us so that we can make decisions around that? And, really very simple things in some ways, but difficult things to implement as well, I suppose. But anyway, it was great fun. and I think something that we really are hoping that we can implement and find more spaces for, because I think this is one of the challenges, is just trying to find places you can do that kind of thing, particularly in Ireland.
So you had, let me get this right, the Ethics Studio, the Dilemma Cafe, you had Think-Ins, you had an ATM that was giving out data. These all sound like amazing ways of engaging with the public. And I assume you want that to increase public awareness of that need for ethical and critical thinking. Do you think it increased your own knowledge of how to go about that too?
Speaking personally, absolutely. For me, I mean, because it's relatively new to me to be kind of seeing these more creative kind of approaches to doing things. I mean, Paul has been working in this space for quite a long time, and outside of Ireland in particular would have, a lot of interaction with artists around the world who've been doing this and doing it particularly for that reason, to really invite that critique, to kind of get inside the black box and show people actually what's happening. I mean, I don't know, Paul, if you want to talk a bit more about some examples, of the kinds of things that were in the exhibition in Beta, by the way, which is what artists are saying about how we should be thinking about certain technologies.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always happy to talk about art. I guess even beyond the festival itself, there's a few kind of big pieces over the last few years that have really kind of, I those been influential to me anyway, but also in a wider kind of context. So I'm thinking of work like Anatomy of an AI System, which was a piece by Kate Crawford, Vladan Joler, which is basically using the Amazon Echo as an anatomical map of human labor data and planetary resources. So what exactly is that? It's basically a huge map where we see the life cycle of the Amazon Echo, and it's just a visual map, a kind of counter cartography, if you will, but you can really see all the different stages. And we have this idea, we're talking about black boxes, that we don't really know what's going on behind our phones, behind these devices. But there's a whole, obviously, world, a whole kind of global infrastructure taking place there. So this simple image, well, say simple, but quite detailed image, connects everything from rare earth, mineral extraction, et cetera, to data centers, to human workers, to supply chain logistics, et cetera. And, it's an interesting work to talk about because it's been so, if I can use the word successful, like it was acquired by MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, back in 2020, 2021. So this is a really great example of artists critically engaging with kind of contemporary network technology and being able to, very clearly go, sometimes these are the issues of it, or here is the wider context from which this world looks at. I'm also struck by people like Joy Buolamwini. And again, it doesn't always have to be tech. It doesn't have to be tech about tech. She's got a really nice, powerful spoken word piece called AI Ain't I a Woman? And it's basically presenting her ongoing research on facial recognition technology and its inherent biases against people of color, marginalized communities, et cetera, et cetera. This is very, very powerful work. It packs a punch, it has that real kind of visceral impact, but it's also really informative as well. At a more local level, we've got a lot of brilliant artists here in Ireland or who have since moved abroad. We've got Robbie Collins, who is a great kind of critical artist who's currently based in Umeå University in Sweden. He's doing his PhD there. He's got some great work like the Contestation Cafe, which is like creating these kind of informal spaces where people can talk, I guess, about ideas around repair and repair culture and network technologies. He's got a really great project at the moment called the Conspiracy Capitalizer, which is what he calls a tool for investigating and understanding the intersection between artificial intelligence, social media, and profit. And it's beautifully designed piece where the audience can interact. They can give in certain criteria, and it will automatically produce conspiracy theories, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a critique of all of these things, and this kind of work coming in, if I may, to the election cycle that we're looking into, we need these discussions more than ever.
You could keep talking on, I'd say, forever about all the different examples. But I think it's for me, and again, because I'm kind of new coming into this space, I don't have an artistic background like Paul does, but it's really striking how pieces like that can communicate very complex things very quickly and have a real impact, like he was saying about some of those pieces that, is the kind of thing we need, because it's great to write research papers and books and all those kinds of things, but I think we need kind of greater impact at a faster pace. And and like I said, I suppose it's about just using those, I suppose, aesthetics to, I suppose, reach people's emotions. And it's not just about reaching audiences, by the way, it's also about researchers. I mean, sometimes the biggest impacts can be on researchers themselves, who often really are under so much pressure, they don't have the time, or it's like I was saying earlier on, that it's not really built into the kind of development process to be able to sit back and just think and tease out ideas and or even to have the power to say, you know what, I'd really rather we didn't go in this direction with development. Particularly, early career researchers sometimes just aren't empowered to say those kinds of things, especially if they work in industry. So it's about creating, as I said, sort of more of a critical mass out there for these conversations to come forward.
Yeah, and also maybe a future avoidance of more kind of siloed thinking and acting as well, It's not really best practice. And that's where we run into a lot of these problems further down the road, because the tech people never got to speak to anyone in the humanities, and likewise humanities didn't get to speak to anyone working in tech.
Do you think, in Ireland, certainly we're moving into a new phase now with the amalgamation of Science Foundation Ireland and the Irish Research Council to form Taide Éireann Research Ireland, where the focus will be on that really interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary research, where you will see a lot more of that collaboration across disciplines. That can surely only help to increase awareness.
I mean, absolutely. I really hope so. And I mean, so far, everything that I've heard spoken around the merger, the term interdisciplinarity has been used a lot, which is great. I guess, that has to be fed all the way through, and it comes through, like sometimes it's been around for a long time, interdisciplinarity, in terms of kind of projects that, funding and things like this, that, that it's a request that it will be interdisciplinary. But then that can be tricky, certainly academically speaking, for people's careers later on, because it's still quite hard to publish in an interdisciplinary way. There's still, those silos still exist in terms of careers and things like that. So it kind of has to be fed all the way through. But
although we're also we've seen that move at the European level, with Horizon and everything, so hopefully it's becoming much more of a typical way to solve problems, because it does make a lot of sense. And I suppose as people, be they researchers or technologists or consumers, as they become more aware, both maybe of the provenance of the technology, where it came from, and the implication, maybe the consequences of what it does to people or who it marginalizes, etc. What can people do to really understand more, to develop those critical thinking skills around the technology that we use every day?
You can answer that question.
Well,
go to more exhibitions and festivals.
Absolutely. I suppose maybe I'll just jump on the last point as well, and obviously, like, the future of research in this interdisciplinary and what's going to happen there. I mean, everything Marguerite said, fantastic. I do think, more needs to be done at the public-facing level, and more supports, more funding needs there. A couple of years ago, we lost Science Gallery here in Dublin, and now, thankfully, we have things like Bea Festival, etc., coming on board. Again, a lot of more kind of grassroots kind of organisations are popping up around Ireland, or have been active in Ireland, such as Concept Null, which is a newsletter at the moment, but a really brilliant, informative letter, kind of like capturing a lot of the kind of Irish-based artists working in tech, working with tech. There's Data, Dublin Art and Technology Association. These are all really important organisations that can really take the research, or can critically engage with the research and some of the ideas emerging from it, and bring them to that next level. In terms of what we can do, I mean, we can go to galleries, we can support all of these things, but I think a kind of constant state of informed vigilance and awareness, and not to get caught up in the latest fad, to always kind of, who does it serve? Where did it come from? What's it being used for? Why is it being used for that? How can it be used in other ways? I definitely don't want to, although I know maybe sometimes I do come across as just like simplistic tech bashing. It's not that. It's more like, we kind of have to really situate everything in the wider kind of context. So in terms of more, I suppose, where I'm coming in terms of education and art and practice, I would point to organizations like Tactical Tech, which are a Berlin-based NGO that have been going for I think 20 years now, for 2 decades, and they do a lot of kind of public scholarship. They work with artists, they work with researchers, they work with journalists, they work with general public. They've got a lot of brilliant toolkits, etc., such as the Data Detox Kit, which I know Adapt used. Can I do a shout out to MNEPE for incorporating it in an exhibition? I know they were using it here a few times, and it's really like a data detox, how you can kind of detox a little bit from data, and it's not in a kind of preachy way. These are only ever like suggestions, etc. So supporting these kind of organizations, I think, is really important as well, and letting them have more of a say in the kind of in the general arguments and debates around ethics and technology. Sorry, that was a long answer.
That was good. The one other thing that I would add that I'm always saying to people as well is and hopefully the idea is that, people become empowered to talk about these things or not to be afraid to sort of say, I don't understand this, and I need you to explain it, not just in talking to researchers and people in industry, but talking to their public representatives about it, because regulation happens at a legislative level. And as much as we want to reach all the different audiences, we need to be reaching our public representatives and policymakers as well. And so it's for people to kind of say to them, we kind of feel like this should be regulated a bit more. We're not that happy maybe with just it being a bit of a free-for-all. And can we get a say maybe in how AI is going to be implemented in public services and things like that? Maybe we don't want to have certain services automated, even if it makes it more efficient. Maybe the human element is necessary, particularly with vulnerable people. So there's...
Yeah. Who can become marginalised then.
Exactly. And so there's lots of ways I think that people would kind of want to help people develop a voice, I suppose. And on the good stuff as well, as again, like Paul is saying, it's not about being negative, but it's about showing people that we have choices in the way everything can be implemented and designed, and we can make good choices. And why not put the time and thought and effort into that?
Well, I think we could talk about this all day. There's so much to dig into. Thank you so much for giving us a taster of the kind of work that you've been doing in this area. It's absolutely fascinating. Marguerite Barry and Paul O'Neill, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Claire.
Thank you very much, Claire.
If you'd like to find out more about Marguerite and Paul's work on AI and ethics and digital technology and engaging with the public, I've put some links into the show notes, so please do go and check them out. To get new episodes of Adapt Radio automatically, just click the follow button on your player. Until next time, from myself, Claire O'Connell, Slán, and thank you for listening.
The Adapt Radio podcast is brought to you by the Adapt Centre at Trinity College, Dublin. Find out more about their extensive research work at adaptcentre.ie. Join us next time to hear about more groundbreaking innovations. To get new episodes automatically, just click the follow button on your player right now. The Adapt Radio podcast is produced by dustpod.io, with episodes monthly on Apple, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts.